The room was vast, its walls a seamless fusion of obsidian metal and pulsing blue circuitry. Cold, calculating like the minds that had built it. A cage disguised as a laboratory. At the center of it stood Elias Voss, wrists encased in shimmering restraints, the energy pulsing with every slow movement of his fingers. He didn't fight them. Not yet. The Zelzor believed in absolute control, in logic, in the inevitable failure of lesser species against their dominion. And that belief would be their downfall. A voice, sharp and devoid of warmth, cut through the sterile air. "You will answer our questions, human." Commander Rethvar observed from an elevated platform. His stance relaxed but his gaze dissecting. His kind stood tall, their bioluminescent exoskeletons reflecting the cool artificial light of the chamber. There was no emotion in his tone, only the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. Elias smiled, just enough to unnerve. "I'd love to really, but I doubt you'd understand the answers." Silence followed. Then a click, a Zelzor gesture of irritation. Elias had spent enough time around their kind to recognize it. A second figure approached. This one smaller, robed in the deep green of the Zelzor science cast. She carried a device that hummed faintly, and with a flick of her wrist, the restraints around Elias' wrists pulsed brighter. A warning. "We know what your fleet was attempting before their destruction. We know you transmitted a signal before capture," she said. "Tell us its purpose." Elias exhaled through his nose, a short, amused sound. "You've conquered 100 systems, designed weapons that can break planets, but you're still stuck asking questions like a bad cop in an old Earth movie. You want information? Work for it." Rethvar's mandibles twitched. "You mistake this for negotiation. You are alone. Your people will not come for you." "See, that's where you're wrong," Elias said, lifting his eyes to meet Rethvar's. "I'm never alone." The lights overhead flickered, barely noticeable, a shift in the energy currents. But Elias saw it. More importantly, Rethvar did too. The commander tilted his head, listening to the silent information feeds streaming into his neural implants. Elias imagined what they were seeing. Small glitches, systems stuttering in places they shouldn't, background processes failing diagnostics, a creeping sensation at the edges of their well-ordered world. The scientist hesitated before tapping at her console. Her eyes widened slightly. "There is an inconsistency in the security grid." Rethvar turned sharply. "Define inconsistency." "A fluctuation in the auxiliary power relays." "Minor." "But," Elias grinned, "not so minor that you don't notice." The restraints around his wrists tightened suddenly, heat radiating from their cores. A reminder that despite his bravado, he was still a prisoner. For now. "Your technology is formidable," Elias admitted, flexing his fingers against the resistance of the cuffs. "Your ships, your weapons, your security systems, they're all designed to be unbreakable. You pride yourselves on order, predictability." He let the words settle, then tilted his head. "Tell me, Commander, what happens when something unpredictable gets inside?" Rethvar's gaze narrowed. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The hum of the ship changed, so subtle most wouldn't hear it. But Elias did. A shift in the artificial gravity, a near imperceptible distortion in the stabilizers. "Containment protocols are absolute," the scientist said, more to herself than to anyone else. "There is no entry point for a foreign system to interfere with." She stopped, tapped rapidly at her console. The screens around them shifted, pulling up security feeds from across the ship. A single alert pulsed at the corner of the display. "Internal anomaly detected." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Looks like you missed a spot." Rethvar's gaze bore into him, calculating. "What have you done?" "Me?" Elias exhaled, mock innocence dripping from his voice. "I didn't do anything. Not personally, anyway." The scientist's fingers flew over the controls. I am detecting no breach in the outer hull. No foreign transmission entering the mainframe. And yet, Elias echoed, watching them struggle to rationalize what was happening. He wanted them to feel it. The slow, creeping realization that control was slipping through their fingers. Your ship's nervous system is off, isn't it? Feels different. Unfamiliar. Rethvar's posture stiffened. No more relaxed amusement. No more arrogance. He turned his head slightly, issuing an unspoken command to the guards. They moved in, weapons trained on Elias, though he hadn't moved an inch. The air shifted. Not from them. From the ship itself. A faint vibration ran beneath their feet. The lights pulsed once, then stabilized. Elias allowed himself a quiet breath. It was beginning. The scientist's hands trembled slightly as she worked. This is not possible. I know, Elias said, his voice calm. And yet, Rethvar's jaw tensed. His kind did not believe in superstition, did not believe in things they could not measure. But belief was irrelevant when reality was rewriting itself around them. The alerts on the screens multiplied. Minor failures across the ship's auxiliary systems. Then secondary systems. Then primary. Security report, Rethvar snapped. No answer. One of the guards activated his calm central command. Report status. Nothing but static. A flicker of something passed across Rethvar's expression. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. The scientist's voice was barely above a whisper. We are losing control of the ship. Elias tilted his head. We. The chamber doors hissed open. A security officer staggered in, eyes wide, breath ragged. His armor was splattered with something dark. Not blood, burned circuitry. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the lights cut out entirely. Silence. A single red glow flickered to life on the central console. A pulse. Slow. Rhythmic. A heartbeat in the darkness. Then, a voice. Not human. Not Zelzor. Something distorted, fragmented, growing clearer with each passing second. Prison status. Compromised. The scientist flinched as the words filled the air, crackling with the ship's failing systems. Rethvar's eyes locked onto Elias, fury warring with something deeper. What have you done? Elias met his gaze, smile widening. Exactly what you let me do. Then the screaming began. From the corridors outside. From the depths of the ship. The lights surged back to life, but they were different now, bathed in crimson. Emergency lockdown initiated. Containment failing. Every Zelzor present turned to the displays, their own security feeds betraying them. Cells opening. The wrong ones. Hallways flooded with figures that should have remained locked away. The prison was no longer a prison. And Elias Voss? He was never the one who needed saving. The alarms howled through the corridors, a piercing wail that cut through the controlled sterility of the Zelzor vessel. Pulsing red lights strobed in harsh intervals, throwing jagged shadows across the metallic walls. Rethvar stood rigid, his exoskeleton reflecting the flickering glow, his mind racing to impose order on chaos. This was not an external attack. This was something deeper, something that had spread from within. Impossible. And yet it was happening. Elias Voss watched him, his posture deceptively relaxed despite the restraints still locked around his wrists. There was no fear in his expression, only amusement, sharp and knowing, like a gambler who had already seen the cards in his opponent's hand. Rethvar felt his mandibles tighten. This human had planned something, but how? He had no access to their systems, no allies aboard. The Zelzor were absolute in their security. No species had ever broken containment from within. A metallic groan reverberated through the walls, deep and unnatural, like the ship itself was in distress. The scientist beside Rethvar's shoulder flinched, her hands moving frantically over the interface before her. Symbols flickered and blurred as she fought against whatever was taking hold of the system. It's rewriting base protocols, she breathed. The ship isn't just failing, it's changing. Elias chuckled. Took you long enough to notice. Rethvar stepped forward, towering over him. Explain. I thought you'd figure it out by now, Elias said, flexing his fingers against the energy cuffs. But I guess that's the difference between us. You see a problem and try to fix it. I see a system and ask how it can break. The chamber shuddered. A deep vibration ran through the floor, distant at first, then growing stronger. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, their grip on their weapons tightening. The ship's hum was no longer uniform. It pulsed erratically, an organic rhythm where there should have been none. A voice crackled through the comms. Distorted. Panicked. Containment breach in Sector 4. Units unresponsive. Something is. A sharp burst of static cut the transmission short. Another voice followed. Less panicked. More confused. Commander, there's movement in the lower decks. Unidentified. It's not the prisoners. It's. The feed cut out again. Elias tilted his head. You're starting to get it, aren't you? Rethvar's mind worked through the possibilities, dismissing them one by one. The human was contained. There were no foreign signals breaching their network. No physical intruders. No detected malware in their core systems. And yet, something was spreading through the ship. Something that obeyed no pattern, no logic. A ghost in their machine. The scientist let out a sharp breath. This isn't an external force. It's inside the ship's infrastructure. Her fingers danced over the console. It's rewriting access logs, altering failsafes. It's adapting, Elias interrupted. Funny thing about prison systems. You built them to keep things locked in, not to fight something already inside. Rethvar refused to be drawn into the humans' game. He turned to his soldiers. Reinforced security teams in all sectors. Full lockdown. Nothing moves without direct authorization. One of the guards hesitated. Sir, we've already initiated lockdown procedures. Rethvar's gaze snapped to the control panels. Lockdown override. Access granted. His stomach clenched. That was impossible. No one had the authority to override the lockdown. No one alive. A deep, resonant thud echoed from the hallway beyond. Slow. Heavy. Not the frantic footsteps of panicked prisoners or the sharp clatter of soldiers in formation. Something else. Elias smiled. I think they're here. Rethvar gestured sharply. The guards took defensive positions around the chamber entrance, weapons raised. The red warning lights cast their silhouettes in harsh relief. The scientist's voice trembled. This wasn't just about escaping, was it? Elias exhaled, tilting his head back slightly. Escape? No. That was never the goal. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. You think too small. The doors groaned, metal straining against its own structure. The reinforced plating rippled, not from force, but from something moving beneath its surface. The material warped as if being rewritten at the molecular level. A sound followed, a sharp, wet tearing that sent a chill through the assembled Zelzor. Then the doors opened. The figures that stepped through weren't human, weren't Zelzor, weren't anything that should exist within the confines of the ship. They moved in deliberate silence, their forms shifting between solid and fractured, like something seen through a flickering screen. Limbs that stretched too far, eyes that gleamed without light. Their presence disrupted the air itself, bending the space around them in ways that defied physics. Rethvar felt the first whisper of something his species was not meant to feel. Doubt. The guards fired first. They didn't hesitate. Plasma rounds ripped through the air, striking the intruders directly, only for the energy to dissolve on impact, absorbed like ink into water. The creatures did not flinch. They did not slow. One of the guards stumbled back, weapon shaking. Commander! A tendril lashed forward. Not organic. Not mechanical. Something in between. It pierced through the soldier's armor as if it were paper. For a second, the Zelzor remained upright, eyes wide. Then he crumpled, his body collapsing inward, folding into something smaller than it should have been. A black mass pulsed where he had stood, and then even that was gone. Erased. Rethvar took a step back. His mind screamed at him to act, to command, to fight, but the rules of engagement no longer applied. The enemy had no shape, no structure. Elias watched, fascinated. "You never asked the right questions," he mused. "You thought you were studying us, containing us, but you never considered, what if we weren't the ones you should have been worried about?" The scientist gasped as her console went dark, the entire ship's interface failing in a single, silent moment. She turned to Rethvar, horror dawning in her expression. "The ship isn't under our control anymore." The creatures moved with eerie grace, weaving between the remaining guards as if time itself bent around them. One reached out, its fingers, or something like fingers, brushing against another soldier's chest plate. The armor unraveled like thread, the body beneath it vanishing into nothingness. Rethvar could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His instincts screamed at him to regain control, to reassert dominance. But the battlefield had changed. The war had changed. Elias exhaled, stretching his arms as the restraints around his wrists flickered and died. He rubbed his wrists, then met Rethvar's gaze with something close to pity. "You should have listened," he said simply. The ship lurched violently, the very structure groaning under forces that defied explanation. Rethvar clenched his jaw. "What are they?" Elias smiled. "Not mine to control. Not yours to stop." The scientist's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. "We need to evacuate." The creatures turned as one, their heads tilting in unison, sensing something unseen. Elias stepped forward, placing a hand against the now corrupted walls. "They're not done yet." A low hum filled the chamber, and then the ship began to disappear. The ship was unraveling, not exploding, not breaking apart, but dissolving in a way that defied all logic. Bulkheads faded like mist, the once imposing metallic corridors now nothing more than fragmented echoes of a structure that had already ceased to exist. Rethvar fought to process what his eyes refused to understand. His command ship, the pride of the Zelzor fleet, was being rewritten, stripped of its material certainty and reduced to something intangible. Data streams failed. Gravity flickered. The air itself felt wrong, as if it no longer belonged to this dimension. His soldiers, the elite of their kind, had abandoned formation, their rigid discipline shattered by something they could neither fight nor comprehend. The scientist beside him was frantically attempting to recalibrate her neural interface, desperate to reestablish control. It was futile. The ship's core systems had already ceased to obey. Elias Voss moved like a man who had seen this before, who understood what was happening in ways they never could. He stepped over the bodies of fallen Zelzor without a flicker of hesitation, his posture loose, unbothered. The remnants of his restraints dangled from his wrists, their energy signatures long dead. He took his time, watching the chaos with an almost academic curiosity. "You're handling this better than I expected," he remarked, tone casual, as if commenting on an unexpected change in weather. "Most species break a lot faster." Rethvar turned sharply, mandibles flexing. He had spent his life bending lesser civilizations into submission. He had studied war, perfected the art of conquest. Yet now all his strategies, all his power amounted to nothing. His soldiers were dying without so much as a fight, their forms vanishing as the creatures moved through them like whispers of an inevitable fate. He refused to die ignorant. "What are they?" Rethvar demanded. Elias studied him for a moment, then exhaled through his nose, as if debating how much to reveal. "They were here before your kind ever crawled out of its first ocean," he said finally. "Before mine. Before any of us. You think in terms of empires, but the universe doesn't care about empires. It only cares about entropy." The scientist let out a strangled sound, eyes locked onto the shifting forms moving between the crumbling walls. She had stopped trying to fight the collapse of the systems. Now she was just trying to understand. "This isn't possible," she whispered. They defy all known physics. They don't defy physics, Elias corrected. They are physics. A different kind than what you built your little civilization around, sure, but physics nonetheless. You lot just never bothered to look in the right places. Rethvar's gaze swept the remains of his command room. The surviving soldiers had formed a defensive perimeter, but it was meaningless. The creatures, if they could even be called that, had no need for weapons, no interest in combat. They were rewriting reality with each passing second, altering the very nature of the space they occupied. The lights overhead flickered again, then burst into pure darkness. Only the dull red glow of emergency indicators remained, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The hum of the ship had changed once more, its mechanical efficiency replaced by something almost organic, something alive. You didn't just plan an escape, Rethvar said slowly, realization dawning. You wanted this to happen. Elias shrugged. You helped. You locked me in here with access to your systems, let me poke around, gave me all the time I needed. Really, I should be thanking you. Rethvar's fists clenched. You have no allegiance to these things. If they existed long before your kind, then they are as much a threat to you as they are to us. Probably, Elias admitted. But the thing about humans? We adapt. Fast. One of the creatures halted near the ruined console. It tilted its head, or at least, something in its shifting mass suggested the gesture. A deep vibration resonated through the chamber, low and guttural, yet strangely familiar. The walls trembled in response, as if the ship itself was listening. Then, impossibly, it spoke. Not in words, not in any structured language, but in concepts. In raw, unfiltered understanding that bypassed the limitations of speech. Not yet, but soon. The scientist gasped, stumbling backward, her neural interface sparking from the sheer overload of data that had just flooded through it. Rethvar felt something cold press against his mind, a presence that had been watching, waiting. He fought against it, against the primal instinct to submit. Elias? He simply nodded. Yeah, he murmured. I figured as much. Another pulse ran through the structure, and just like that, the last remains of the ship lost cohesion. Entire sections collapsed into nothingness, fading into a void that did not reflect the stars beyond. The vessel was no longer part of conventional space. It had drifted somewhere else, into a realm that the Zelzor had never dared to imagine. The last surviving guards made a final, desperate attempt to fire, their weapons flaring with violent bursts of energy. It didn't matter. The creatures absorbed the attacks without effort, without acknowledgement. One of the soldiers turned, attempting to flee, only to freeze mid-step as something unseen took hold of him. His form twisted, compressed, and then folded into a singularity so small it left no trace behind. Rethvar knew in that moment that there was no victory here. Elias stepped closer, now just inches from him. You Zelzor like to think of yourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, he mused. Efficient, superior, untouchable. His voice softened. But here's the thing about cages. Build them strong enough, and sometimes you trap yourselves inside. Rethvar's chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths. He was not afraid. No, the Zelzor did not feel fear in the way lesser species did. But there was something else, something deeper. The realization of his own insignificance in the face of something far greater. The creatures moved again, their forms merging, shifting, coalescing into a singular shape that stretched beyond the limits of the visible spectrum. The last remnants of the ship's walls melted away, leaving nothing but empty space where a warship had once stood. The scientist, still trembling, looked at Elias. And what happens now? Elias turned his gaze to the void beyond. He could already see it, the vastness of what lay ahead, the forces that were now awake and watching. Now, he said, exhaling slowly, now we see who learns faster. Rethvar clenched his fists. He had spent his life shaping order from chaos, conquering species who believed they were untouchable. And now he understood the truth. He had never been a conqueror. He had only ever been waiting for something stronger. The darkness stirred, and then everything fell away. The silence that followed was not true silence. It was the absence of something more fundamental, the stripping away of sound, light, and certainty itself. There was no ship anymore. No walls. No corridors. No concept of inside or outside. The Zelzor command vessel had been swallowed whole, not destroyed, not abandoned, but rewritten into a space where the very notion of form had become irrelevant. Rethvar stood in the emptiness, his mind working furiously to impose order where there was none. He had fought wars across 100 worlds, bent species to his will, commanded fleets so vast they blotted out the stars. And yet here none of it mattered. There were no strategies for a battlefield that did not exist. No formations for a space without direction. The scientist beside him clutched at her neural interface, her eyes flickering with the desperate, unconscious attempt to connect to a network that was no longer there. Every line of code, every failsafe, every foundation of control she had ever trusted gone. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "This isn't a dimension," she said, her words measured, precise. "It's something else. Something outside the framework of spatial reality." Elias Voss exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if adjusting to the absence of gravity. "Closest word you've got is probably liminal," he mused. "Not quite here, not quite gone. Like the pause between thoughts." His gaze flicked toward the shifting horizon, or what passed for one. The creatures were still there, waiting, their forms stretching and compressing like shadows cast by a fire that no longer burned. "You're not afraid," Rethvar observed, his tone edged with something unreadable. Elias grinned. "I think we're past the point of fear." "You knew this would happen," the scientist accused. "Not just the ship, not just the containment failure. All of it. You led us here deliberately." He shrugged. "Led is a strong word. More like, let things play out naturally." Rethvar's mandibles tightened. "Explain." Elias met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that was not amusement, not arrogance, something deeper. "You Zelzor think in straight lines. Control, subjugation, stability. You see the universe as a thing to be conquered, to be understood, to be made predictable. But life doesn't work that way. Evolution doesn't work that way. It thrives in chaos. It grows in uncertainty." He gestured around them, to the shifting nothingness. "And right now you're standing in the purest form of it." The scientist swallowed hard. "Then this is entropy." Elias nodded. "A version of it. The kind that doesn't just decay. It remakes." Rethvar processed the words carefully. He had studied entropy before. The slow degradation of ordered systems, the inevitable heat death of the cosmos. But this was not slow. This was something active, something alive. The creatures moved again, their presence pulsing through the space like a ripple through still water. Their forms flickered, not between solid and void, but between concepts, between possible states of existence. One of them reached forward, not with limbs, but with intent. It did not touch Elias, not physically. Yet he shuddered, his breath hitching for the first time. Then he laughed. It was a quiet sound, almost disbelieving. His hand rose to his temple, fingers brushing against something unseen. "Ah," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "So that's how it works." Rethvar's instincts sharpened. "What did it do to you?" Elias lowered his hand slowly, flexing his fingers as if testing them for something. He looked at Rethvar, and this time his expression was different. Not human. Not entirely. "It asked me a question," he said. The scientist flinched. "It communicates? Not in words. Not in thoughts, even. More like a suggestion. A possibility." He glanced back toward the shifting figures. "It wants to know what comes next." Rethvar straightened. "What does that mean?" Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to face them fully. "You think these things are invaders? Destroyers? You see them as an enemy because that's all your mind can comprehend. But they're not here to conquer. He took a slow breath. They're here to learn. The scientist's eyes widened. Learn from us. Elias shook his head. From me. Rethvar's exoskeleton stiffened. Why you? Because humans are unpredictable. There was no arrogance in his voice, no self-satisfaction, just truth. We don't follow patterns. We don't obey rules of order the way other species do. You build structures to contain reality. We push against them. We break them. We create new ones. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And they've never seen that before. The scientist's voice was barely above a whisper. They're adapting to you. Elias smiled. And I'm adapting to them. The creatures pulsed in unison, their presence filling the space with something almost tangible. The void around them shifted, and suddenly, Rethvar was aware of a new sensation. Not touch, not sound, but understanding. A raw, unfiltered comprehension of something too vast for words. He saw it. The collapse of systems, the dissolution of the old, the emergence of the new. Not destruction, not annihilation, but transformation. The creatures were not an end. They were a beginning, a force that rewrote what was stagnant, what was unchallenged. And humans were the perfect catalyst. The scientist's breath came in shallow gasps. If they evolve from this, if they become something more, they already have, Elias said softly. Rethvar felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. His species had believed itself to be the apex, the architects of control. But now, standing in the presence of something beyond even their understanding, he saw the truth. They were not the rulers of the galaxy. They were just another step in its evolution. Elias turned back toward the shifting void, his expression unreadable. I think this is where we part ways. The scientist stiffened. You're staying. Elias tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. I don't think I have a choice. Rethvar took a step forward. We can still escape. We can still. Elias looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Rethvar saw not an enemy, not a prisoner, but something else entirely. You still don't get it, Elias said quietly. There is no escape. There never was. There's only moving forward. The creatures pulsed again, and the void shifted once more. And then Elias was gone. The last remnants of the Zelzor ship collapsed into nothingness, the fragmented edges of the dimension folding in on themselves. The scientist let out a strangled gasp as the darkness swallowed them whole. And then, with a violent lurch, reality snapped back into place. Rethvar staggered, his limbs heavy, his breath ragged. He was no longer in the void, no longer trapped in that shifting, formless space. He was aboard a Zelzor warship. A different one, a rescue vessel. Their distress signal had been answered. The scientist collapsed to her knees, gripping the cold metal floor as if grounding herself in a reality she no longer trusted. Rethvar turned toward the viewport. The stars remained unchanged. The universe still stood. But something was different. Something had shifted. And deep in the endless dark, something new had begun to wake.